the basement of the Blackridge house, a rocking chair moves by itself in the darkness. On the wall, scratched in dried blood, ancient symbols pulse with an otherworldly glow, and somewhere in the shadows, a voice whispers in a language that predates human civilization. The son will inherit what the father cannot escape. The autumn wind of 1814 carried more than fallen leaves through the hills of Millgate, Massachusetts. It carried whispers that only one man could hear. Elias Blackridge stood at the edge of the barren hilltop, his weathered hands gripping the surveyor's tools as his pale blue eyes stared into the distance. The locals in the village below had warned him about this place, how cattle refused to graze here, how birds never nested in the twisted oak trees, how even the hardiest weeds struggled to take root in the dark soil. But Elias heard something else entirely. "Here," he whispered to himself, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp October air. "They want me to build it here." His wife, Martha, approached cautiously from behind, her brown woolen dress rustling against the dry grass. At 28, she had learned to recognize the distant look in her husband's eyes, the same expression he wore during his episodes back in Salem, before they fled to this remote corner of New England. "Elias, my love," she said softly, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Perhaps we should consider the plot near the river instead. The soil would be richer there, and we'd be closer to the village for supplies." Elias turned to face her, and Martha stepped back involuntarily. His pupils were dilated, almost black, and there was something unsettling about his smile, too wide, too knowing. "Martha, dear heart," he said, his voice carrying an odd cadence as if he were repeating words spoken by someone else. "This is where we belong. This is where our family will flourish for generations to come." The wind picked up, and Martha pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. In the distance she could hear the church bells of Millgate ringing the evening hour. But here on the hill, the sound seemed muffled, distorted. "What voices, Elias?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "You mentioned voices in your letter to your brother. What do they tell you?" Elias knelt down and ran his fingers through the dark earth, as if greeting an old friend. "They tell me truths, Martha. Ancient truths about power, about legacy, about the price we pay for greatness." He looked up at her with those unsettling black eyes. "They tell me our son will be special. Different from other children." Martha's hand instinctively moved to her still flat stomach. They had been trying for a child for 3 years, and she had only recently begun to hope that her prayers might be answered. "What son?" she whispered. Elias's smile widened further, revealing teeth that seemed somehow sharper than before. "The son who will carry on what I begin here. The son who will understand the true nature of our family's gift." As if summoned by his words, a murder of crows suddenly erupted from the surrounding trees, their harsh cries filling the air like a funeral dirge. Martha watched in horror as they circled overhead, their black wings blotting out the dying sunlight. "Elias, please," she pleaded, reaching for his hand. "Let's go back to the inn. We can discuss this properly with clear heads." But when she touched his skin, it was ice cold, despite the mild weather, and for just a moment she could have sworn she heard them too. Whispers in a language that made her soul recoil, promising things that mortal minds weren't meant to comprehend. Elias stood up, brushing the dirt from his hands. "Tomorrow, I'll begin clearing the land. The foundation must be laid before the first snow." He turned to face the village below, where warm lights flickered in cottage windows like fallen stars. "And Martha, my dear wife, you must never speak of what you hear on this hill. Not to the pastor, not to the neighbors, not to anyone. Some secrets are meant to stay buried." As they walked back down the hillside, Martha glanced over her shoulder one last time. In the gathering darkness, she could swear she saw figures moving among the trees, tall, impossibly thin shapes that seemed to bend and flow like smoke. And from somewhere deep beneath the earth, she heard the sound of something vast and ancient stirring to life. By spring, the house would be complete. By summer, she would be heavy with child. And by winter, she would begin to understand the true horror of what her husband had built upon that cursed hill. But for now, as they walked through the peaceful village of Millgate, past the white-steepled church and the cozy tavern where travelers shared stories by the fire, Martha allowed herself to hope that perhaps the voices were just her husband's imagination, that perhaps their new home would bring them nothing but happiness. She was wrong. The Blackridge legacy was about to begin, and with it 3 generations of unspeakable horror that would stain the very soil of New England with blood, madness, and something far worse than either. In the darkness behind them, the rocking chair that didn't yet exist began to move. The hammer fell with rhythmic precision against the wooden frame, each blow echoing across the hilltop like a heartbeat. Elias Blackridge had been working since dawn, driven by an urgency that bordered on mania. It was May of 1815, and the skeleton of what would become the Blackridge house was taking shape against the gray Massachusetts sky. "Mr. Blackridge, sir," called out Jacob Muller, the German carpenter Elias had hired from Boston. "Perhaps we should rest for the noon meal. The men are growing tired." Elias paused, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the cool spring air. Around him, 4 other workers continued their tasks. 2 local men from Millgate who needed the wages, and 2 drifters who had wandered into town seeking work. All of them had noticed the strange things that happened on the hill, tools that moved when no one was watching, shadows that fell in directions that defied the sun's position, and the sounds, soft whispers that seemed to come from the very wood they were cutting, as if the trees remembered something terrible. "No rest," Elias said, his voice carrying that odd cadence that had become more pronounced over the winter months. "The foundation must be complete before the next full moon." Jacob wiped his brow with a dirty cloth and approached his employer cautiously. At 53, the carpenter had built homes throughout New England, but he had never worked on a project that felt so wrong. "Sir, with respect, the men are talking. Strange things have been happening since we began. Yesterday, Thomas Hartwell swore he saw someone standing in the frame of the house, but when he looked again, there was nothing there." Elias's pale blue eyes, which had grown progressively darker over the months, fixed on Jacob with an intensity that made the older man step back. "Thomas Hartwell drinks too much," Elias replied. "What he sees is his own guilt made manifest." "And what about the Latin, sir?" The question hung in the air like a physical thing. 3 times now, workers had found carved symbols in the wood, intricate designs that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. When Pastor Williams had been called to examine them, he had gone pale and muttered something about pre-Christian markings before hastily departing. Elias smiled, that unsettling smile that had become his constant expression. "What about it, Jacob?" "You've been speaking it in your sleep, sir. Mrs. Blackridge mentioned it to my wife at the market. Said you recite entire passages, though she knows you never studied the language." The sound of hammering stopped abruptly. The other workers, sensing tension, had ceased their labor and were watching the exchange with growing unease. "My wife talks too much," Elias said quietly. "Perhaps you should remind your wife that gossip is a sin." Jacob's weathered hands tightened around his hammer. "Mr. Blackridge, I've been building homes for over 30 years. I know the feel of a place, the way a structure wants to come together. This house," he gestured toward the half-completed frame, "this house doesn't want to be built. It wants to be something else entirely." For a moment, Elias's expression flickered, and Jacob caught a glimpse of the man he had first met. Confused, frightened, perhaps even fighting against something he didn't understand. But then the darkness returned to his eyes, and when he spoke, his voice seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than his throat. "This house will stand for generations, Jacob Muller. It will shelter my family and my family's family, and it will serve purposes that your simple mind cannot comprehend. You will finish what we have started, or you will leave this place and never speak of what you have seen." The wind picked up suddenly, and with it came the sound of whispers, not from any human throat, but from the very air itself. The partially completed frame groaned and swayed, though there was no logical reason for it to do so. Jacob looked around at his workers. Young Peter Whitmore, barely 18, was staring at the house with wide, terrified eyes. The 2 drifters had quietly begun packing their tools, clearly preparing to leave. Thomas Hartwell was muttering prayers under his breath. "There's something else, sir," Jacob said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something I found this morning when I was checking the foundation." Elias tilted his head, like a bird listening for prey. "What did you find?" "A room, sir, beneath the basement. A room that's not on any of the plans you gave me." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "Show me," Elias said. Jacob led him to the back of the house, where a rough wooden ladder descended into what should have been a simple basement. But as they climbed down, their lanterns revealed something that made Jacob's blood run cold. The basement was larger than it should have been, extending far beyond the footprint of the house above. The walls were not the simple stone foundation they had laid, but something much older, blocks of a dark, almost black stone that seemed to absorb their lamplight, and there in the far corner was an opening that led to another room entirely. "I didn't build this," Jakob whispered. "This was here before we ever broke ground." Elias approached the opening with the confident stride of someone who had been expecting to find exactly what was there. His lantern illuminated a circular chamber carved directly from the bedrock, its walls covered in the same symbols that had been appearing in the wood above. In the center of the room sat a single wooden chair, its high back carved with intricate designs that seemed to move in the flickering light. And though no one was sitting in it, the chair was rocking back and forth with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. "My God," Jakob breathed. "What is this place?" Elias stepped into the chamber and immediately the rocking stopped. The silence was so complete that both men could hear their own heartbeats. "This is why I was called here, Jakob. This is why the voices led me to this hill." Elias ran his hand along the arm of the chair, and for a moment, Jakob could have sworn he saw something else in the room. A tall, shadowy figure standing behind the chair, its impossible long fingers resting on Elias's shoulders. "This is the heart of the house," Elias continued, his voice echoing strangely in the stone chamber. "This is where the true work will be done." Jacob began backing toward the opening, his every instinct screaming at him to run. "Mr. Blackridge, sir, I think we should seal this room. Fill it with concrete and never speak of it again." Elias turned to face him, and Jacob saw that his employer's eyes were now completely black. No trace of blue remained. "You will finish the house, Jacob Muller. You will build it exactly as I have shown you, and you will never speak of this room to anyone. Not to your wife, not to Pastor Williams, not to anyone in the village. And if I refuse," Elias's smile was no longer even remotely human, "then you will join whoever built this chamber in the first place, and your wife will wonder why you never came home." Jacob ran. He dropped his lantern and ran through the basement, up the ladder, past the bewildered workers, and down the hill toward Millgate. Behind him he could hear Elias laughing, a sound that seemed to come from multiple throats at once. The next morning, Jacob's wife found him in their bedroom, sitting in his chair by the window, staring up at the Blackridge house on the hill. His hair had turned completely white overnight, and when she spoke to him, he didn't respond. He never spoke again. But the house was completed by autumn, just as Elias had promised. And on the night of the first snowfall, Martha Blackridge gave birth to a son they named Thomas. The midwife who attended the birth would later tell anyone who would listen that the baby's eyes were completely black, and that when she held him, she could hear whispers in a language that predates human speech. But by then, it was too late. The Blackridge legacy had begun in earnest, and the evil that slept beneath the house had found its first heir. Thomas Blackridge was 23 years old when he first realized that his dreams were not his own. It was the winter of 1838, and he sat in his father's study, a room that had been added to the house 3 years earlier, after Elias claimed he needed a proper place to conduct his research. The study was located directly above the basement chamber, though Thomas had never been told about the room below. He didn't need to be told. He could feel it. The leather-bound journal lay open before him, its pages filled with his own handwriting. Neat, precise script that recorded the contents of dreams he couldn't remember having, dreams in Latin, a language he had never studied, but somehow understood with perfect clarity. Pater noster qui in tenebrises sanctificetur nomen tuum. Veniat regnum tuum. Fiat voluntas tua, sicut in caelo et in terra. Thomas read the words aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. It was a perversion of the Lord's Prayer, but twisted into something that made his soul recoil even as his mouth formed the syllables with disturbing ease. Our Father, who art in darkness, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in hell. Thomas? He looked up to find his mother, Martha, standing in the doorway. At 52, she had aged far beyond her years, her once auburn hair now completely gray, her green eyes haunted by 24 years of living in the house on the hill. "Mother," he said, quickly closing the journal, "I didn't hear you come in." Martha stepped into the study, her eyes moving nervously around the room. The walls were lined with books that Elias had acquired over the years, volumes on history, theology, and subjects that Martha preferred not to think about. Ancient texts in languages she didn't recognize, with symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. "Your father wants to see you," she said. "He's in the basement." Thomas felt his stomach clench. He had been avoiding his father for weeks, ever since the dreams had begun. Ever since he had started waking up with dirt under his fingernails and the taste of copper in his mouth. "What does he want?" "He says it's time for you to learn about your inheritance." The word hung between them like a curse. Thomas had grown up knowing that he was different from the other children in Millgate, but he had never understood why. Now, at 23, he was beginning to comprehend the terrible truth. "Mother," he said quietly, "tell me about the night I was born." Martha's face went pale. "Thomas, please. Some things are better left. Tell me about the midwife. Tell me what she said about my eyes." For a moment, Martha looked as if she might flee. But then her shoulders sagged, and she sank into the chair across from his father's desk. "Mrs. Carver was the midwife," she said, her voice barely audible. "She had delivered half the babies in Millgate, never lost a mother or child, but when you were born." She closed her eyes, as if the memory was too painful to bear. "She said your eyes were wrong, black as night," she said, "and when she held you, she claimed she could hear whispers." "What kind of whispers?" "The same kind your father hears. The same kind that led us to this cursed hill." Martha opened her eyes, and Thomas saw tears streaming down her cheeks. "She said you would grow up to be either a great blessing or a terrible curse. She begged me to take you away from here, to raise you somewhere else, anywhere else. But you didn't. Your father wouldn't allow it. He said this was your destiny, your birthright. He said the voices had told him that you would be the one to unlock the family's true potential." Thomas felt the familiar sensation of something moving in the back of his mind, a presence that wasn't his own, ancient and patient and hungry. It had been growing stronger over the years, whispering suggestions that he had learned to ignore, showing him visions of things that hadn't happened yet. "Mother, what's in the basement?" Martha's face went ashen. I don't know. Your father forbade me from ever going down there. Said it was dangerous, that there were things I wouldn't understand. But you've heard things. At night when father goes down there. You've heard him talking to someone." It wasn't a question. Thomas had heard it too. His father's voice, sometimes pleading, sometimes commanding, always answered by something that spoke in a language that predates human civilization. "Thomas, please," Martha whispered. "Don't go down there. Don't become what he's become." But even as she spoke, Thomas could feel the pull growing stronger. The presence in his mind was becoming more insistent, showing him images of the chamber below, of the chair that rocked by itself, of secrets that had been waiting for him since the day he was born. "I have to, Mother. I think I've always known this day would come." The sound of footsteps echoed from the basement, growing closer. Heavy, deliberate steps that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. "Thomas," Elias's voice carried up from below, but it sounded wrong, deeper than it should be, with harmonics that no human throat could produce. "Come down, my son. It's time you learned the truth about our family." Thomas stood up, his legs trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The journal on the desk fell open to a page he didn't remember writing, covered with symbols that seemed to writhe and pulse in the lamplight. "Don't go," Martha pleaded, grabbing his arm. "We can leave, Thomas. We can pack tonight and be gone by morning. We can go to Boston or New York or anywhere but here." Thomas looked down at his mother's hand on his arm, and for a moment he saw something that made his blood run cold. Her fingers were leaving dark marks on his skin, as if she were made of shadow rather than flesh. "Mother," he said softly, "look at your hands." Martha followed his gaze and let out a strangled cry. Her hands were indeed leaving marks, not bruises, but something far worse. Ancient symbols were appearing on Thomas's skin wherever she touched him, burning themselves into his flesh like brands. "What's happening to me?" she whispered. "The same thing that happened to Father," Thomas replied, his voice strangely calm. "The same thing that's been happening to all of us since we came to this place." The footsteps below had stopped, but now Thomas could hear something else. The sound of that rocking chair moving back and forth with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. "The house is alive, isn't it?" he said. "Not alive the way we understand it, but alive in a way that's older and darker and far more patient than human life." Martha was backing toward the door, her hands held out in front of her as if she could ward off whatever was happening to her son. "Thomas, your eyes." He could see his reflection in the window, and he knew what she was seeing. His eyes, which had been a normal brown since childhood, were now completely black. Not just the iris, but the entire eye, as if they were windows into an endless void. "Thomas!" Elias's voice boomed from below, no longer making any pretense of being human. "Come to me, my son. Come and claim your birthright." Thomas walked to the basement door, each step feeling like a choice between salvation and damnation. Behind him he could hear his mother weeping, but the sound seemed to come from very far away. The basement stairs creaked under his weight, and with each step downward he felt something inside him awakening. Knowledge that wasn't his own began flooding his mind. Memories of things that had happened in this house, visions of what was to come, understanding of the terrible purpose for which he had been born. At the bottom of the stairs, his father waited. But the thing that had once been Elias Blackridge was no longer recognizable as human. Tall and impossibly thin, with skin that seemed to shift between flesh and shadow, it smiled at Thomas with too many teeth. "My son," it said, its voice like the sound of wind through dead leaves. "You have come at last." "What are you?" Thomas whispered. "I am what you will become. What every Blackridge man must become, to serve the purpose for which this house was built." The thing gestured toward the opening that led to the chamber below. "Come, let me show you your inheritance." Thomas followed, though every instinct screamed at him to run. In the chamber below, the rocking chair sat empty, but he could feel a presence in it nonetheless, something vast and patient and utterly alien. "Your great-grandfather built this house," the thing that had been his father said. "But he did not build this room. This room was here long before white men came to these shores, before the Indians built their fires on these hills, before humanity learned to speak. This room is as old as the darkness between the stars." Thomas approached the chair, drawn by a force he couldn't resist. "What does it want?" "It wants what it has always wanted. To spread, to grow, to fill the world with its children." The thing placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder, and he felt something like ice water flowing through his veins. "Our family are its priests, Thomas, its servants, its vessels." "And if I refuse?" The thing that had been his father laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Look at your hands, my son." Thomas looked down and saw that his hands were changing, becoming longer, more angular, with fingers that ended in points rather than nails. His skin was taking on a grayish pallor, and when he flexed his fingers, he could feel new strength flowing through them. "You cannot refuse," the thing said. "You were born for this. Every Blackridge man is born for this. We are the inheritors of a legacy that stretches back to the beginning of time itself." Thomas sank into the rocking chair, and immediately the whispers began. Not the gentle murmurs he had heard in his dreams, but a cacophony of voices speaking in languages that predated human speech. They told him of civilizations that had risen and fallen in the darkness between stars, of powers that slept beneath the earth, of the price that must be paid for knowledge that mortals were never meant to possess. And in that moment, Thomas understood. He understood why his father had been called to this place, why the house had been built, why he had been born with eyes that saw into the void. He was not Thomas Blackridge anymore. He was something else, something that wore Thomas's face but served a purpose infinitely older and more terrible than human ambition. Upstairs, Martha heard the laughter that echoed from the basement. Two voices now, father and son, joined in a harmony that no human throat could produce. She packed a small bag and fled into the night, but she didn't get far. The next morning, the villagers found her at the edge of the woods, sitting against a tree with her eyes wide open and her mouth frozen in a silent scream. She lived for another 30 years, but she never spoke again, and on quiet nights people claimed they could hear her whispering in Latin, prayers to a god that had no name and no mercy. The house on the hill grew quiet after that, but not empty. Thomas remained, studying the books his father had collected, learning the rituals that would prepare him for his ultimate purpose. And in the basement, the rocking chair moved with a rhythm that counted down the years until the next generation would be born, a generation that would carry the curse even further into the darkness. Samuel Blackridge was born on a night when the very stars seemed to recoil from the earth. It was October 13th, 1867, and the midwife who attended the birth was not Mrs. Carver. She had died years earlier, her hair white and her mind shattered by what she had witnessed in the Blackridge house. Instead, it was her daughter, Rebecca, who had reluctantly agreed to help bring the third generation of Blackridge men into the world. Rebecca would later tell anyone who would listen that the baby emerged in complete silence. No cry, no breath, nothing. For a full minute she thought he was stillborn. Then his eyes opened and she saw that they were not the normal blue of a newborn, but solid black, like pools of ink. And when she held him, she could hear them, the whispers that had haunted the Blackridge family for over 50 years. Thomas Blackridge, now 53, and bearing little resemblance to the young man who had once sat in his father's study, took his son from the midwife with hands that had grown long and angular over the years. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and when he smiled, his teeth were sharp and numerous. "Samuel," he whispered, his voice carrying harmonics that no human throat could produce. "My son, my heir, my legacy." Rebecca fled that night and never returned to the house on the hill. She moved to Boston and spent the rest of her life in a convent, praying for forgiveness for whatever she had helped bring into the world. But Samuel grew, and with each passing year, it became clear that he was different from his father and grandfather. Where they had been drawn gradually into the darkness, Samuel seemed to have been born already immersed in it. By the age of 5, he was speaking in Latin during his sleep. By 10, he could read the ancient texts in his grandfather's study without any instruction. By 15, he had begun keeping his own journal, filling it with symbols and formulas that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. And by 25, he had begun to understand the true purpose of the Blackridge legacy. It was the summer of 1892, and Samuel stood in the basement chamber, studying the rocking chair that had been the center of his family's devotion for 3 generations. The chair was no longer empty, hadn't been for years. Samuel could see the thing that sat in it, tall and impossibly thin, with features that seemed to exist in too many dimensions at once. "Father," he said, addressing the entity that had once been Thomas Blackridge, "I've been having the dreams again." The thing turned its head toward him, and Samuel saw that its eyes were not black like his own, but rather seemed to contain entire galaxies, complete with swirling nebulae and dying stars. "Tell me about the dreams, my son." "They're different this time. Not just whispers or visions, but instructions, detailed instructions about rituals I've never seen, about preparations that must be made." Samuel approached the chair, unafraid of the presence that radiated from it, like heat from a forge. "It's time, isn't it? Time for the final step." The thing that had been Thomas smiled with too many teeth. "You understand more than your father did at your age. More than your grandfather ever did. The bloodline grows stronger with each generation. What am I supposed to do? What you were born to do. What every Blackridge man was born to do. Open the door." Samuel had always known this moment would come. The dreams had been preparing him for it since childhood, showing him visions of a world transformed, of humanity serving a purpose greater than their small, mortal ambitions. "The villagers have been asking questions," he said. "Sheriff Morrison came by last week wanting to know about the sounds people hear at night, about the lights they see in the windows when the house should be empty." "What did you tell him?" "That I live alone, and that old houses make many sounds." Samuel paused, his black eyes reflecting the strange light that emanated from the chair. "But he didn't believe me. I could see it in his face. He knows something is wrong here." The thing leaned forward, its impossible form shifting and flowing like smoke. "Then perhaps it's time to give him something to really worry about." That night, Samuel began the ritual that would define the rest of his life. He had found the instructions in his great-grandfather's journal, written in a hand that had grown progressively less human with each passing year. The ritual required 3 things: blood from the Blackridge line, symbols carved into living flesh, and a willingness to surrender one's humanity completely. Samuel had all 3. He began in the basement chamber, using a knife that had belonged to his great-grandfather to carve symbols into his chest and arms. The pain was extraordinary, but with each cut, he felt something awakening inside him, a presence that had been waiting his entire life to be unleashed. The symbols were not random. They were a map, a guide, a key to unlocking powers that had slept beneath the earth since before the first human learned to make fire. And as Samuel carved them into his flesh, he could feel the very foundations of the house responding. The walls began to bleed. Not blood as humans understood it, but something darker, thicker, more ancient. It seeped from the stones and ran down the walls in patterns that mirrored the symbols on Samuel's body. And with each drop that fell, the whispers grew louder. By midnight, Samuel could no longer distinguish between his own thoughts and the voices that filled his mind. He was speaking in languages that predated human speech, reciting formulas that described the true nature of reality. Not the simple three-dimensional world that mortals inhabited, but the vast, infinite darkness that lay beyond the veil of human perception. And then, as the clock in the village church struck 12, something answered. The rocking chair stopped moving. The whispers fell silent. And in the sudden, absolute quiet, Samuel heard footsteps, not from above, but from below, from depths that shouldn't exist beneath the house. The floor of the chamber began to crack, and through the fissures came a light that wasn't light, a darkness that somehow illuminated, revealing things that the human eye was never meant to see. And through that impossible radiance, something began to emerge. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to stretch into dimensions that human geometry couldn't describe. Its face was a void that contained infinite possibilities, and when it spoke, its voice was the sound of civilizations dying in the darkness between stars. "Samuel Blackridge," it said, and the words seemed to bypass his ears and speak directly to his soul. "Third heir to the covenant, are you prepared to fulfill your purpose?" Samuel knelt before the entity, his carved flesh still bleeding, his black eyes reflecting the impossible light. "I am prepared." "Then receive the gift that has been promised to your bloodline since the foundation of this house was laid." The entity reached out with fingers that seemed to be made of crystallized darkness and touched Samuel's forehead. The contact was like being struck by lightning. But instead of pain, Samuel felt knowledge flooding his mind, understanding of the true nature of the universe, of the powers that slept beneath the earth, of the role that humanity was meant to play in the cosmic order. He saw the past, how his great-grandfather had been chosen, how the house had been built as a focal point for energies that existed beyond human comprehension, how each generation of Blackridge men had been prepared for this moment. He saw the present, how the ritual had torn open a doorway between worlds, how the entity before him was only the first of many that would soon emerge, how the transformation that had begun in his family would soon spread to encompass all of humanity. And he saw the future, a world where the barriers between dimensions had fallen, where ancient powers walked the earth openly, where humanity served purposes that transcended their limited understanding. "It is beautiful," Samuel whispered, tears of joy streaming down his face. "It is perfect." The entity smiled, though it had no mouth in any conventional sense. "The covenant is fulfilled. The door is open. The work can begin." Samuel rose to his feet, but he was no longer entirely human. His limbs had grown longer, more angular, and his skin had taken on the same grayish pallor that marked all the Blackridge men. Most disturbing of all, his eyes, which had been solid black since birth, now contained the same impossible depth as the entities, as if they were windows into the vast darkness that lay beyond the stars. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now you spread the gift. Now you prepare the world for what is to come. Now you ensure that when the time is right, humanity will be ready to serve its true purpose." Samuel nodded, understanding flooding through him like a dark tide. He knew what he had to do, what he had always been destined to do. The ritual was complete, but it was only the beginning. Over the following weeks, strange things began happening in Millgate. Livestock died without apparent cause, their bodies found drained of blood but bearing no wounds. Children woke in the night screaming about voices that spoke in languages their parents couldn't understand. And several townspeople reported seeing figures moving through the woods, tall, impossibly thin shapes that seemed to bend and flow like smoke. Sheriff Morrison organized search parties, but they found nothing. The tracks they followed led to the edge of the Blackridge property and then simply vanished, as if whoever they were pursuing had simply ceased to exist. It was young Timothy Fletcher who first saw Samuel after the ritual. The boy had been hunting rabbits in the woods near the house when he stumbled upon a clearing he had never seen before. In the center of the clearing sat Samuel Blackridge, naked and covered in scars that seemed to move and shift in the afternoon light. Timothy tried to run, but found that his legs wouldn't obey him. Samuel turned to look at him, and the boy saw that his eyes were no longer black. They were empty, containing depths that seemed to go on forever. "Timothy," Samuel said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the boy's teeth ache. "You've come at just the right time." The boy tried to scream, but no sound emerged. Samuel stood up, his transformed body moving with a fluid grace that was utterly inhuman, and approached the paralyzed child. "Don't be afraid," Samuel whispered, placing a hand on Timothy's forehead. "I'm going to give you a gift, the same gift that was given to me and to my father, and to his father before him." Timothy's eyes went wide as he felt something foreign entering his mind. Not thoughts, but something deeper, something that rewrote the very foundations of his consciousness. When Samuel finally released him, the boy was no longer quite human. He returned to the village that evening, appearing normal to casual observation, but his parents noticed that he no longer played with his toys, that he spoke in whispers when he thought no one was listening, and that sometimes late at night, they could hear him laughing at things that weren't there. Timothy was the first, but not the last. Over the course of the summer, Samuel spread his gift to a dozen children in Millgate, each one becoming a carrier of the influence that had consumed the Blackridge family. The children, in turn, began to affect their families, their friends, their teachers. By autumn, half the village had been touched by the darkness that emanated from the house on the hill. Sheriff Morrison finally organized a proper expedition to investigate the Blackridge property. He brought with him 6 armed men, Pastor Williams and Dr. Hendrik Voss, a specialist in mental ailments who had been called in from Boston to examine the growing number of disturbed individuals in the town. They found the house empty, but not abandoned. The furniture was still in place, the books still lined the shelves, and the kitchen showed signs of recent use. But there was no sign of Samuel Blackridge. It was Dr. Voss who insisted on checking the basement despite Pastor Williams' protests. They found the stairs leading down, and then the chamber below, with its stone walls and ancient symbols, and they found the rocking chair, still moving back and forth with that slow, hypnotic rhythm. "My God," whispered Sheriff Morrison. "What is this place?" Dr. Voss approached the chair cautiously, his scientific mind trying to find a rational explanation for what he was seeing. "Some kind of ritual chamber, I'd guess. The symbols appear to be pre-Christian, possibly Celtic or Germanic in origin. They're not Celtic," Pastor Williams said, his voice tight with fear. "They're not from any earthly culture. I've seen similar markings in books that should have been burned centuries ago." Sheriff Morrison was examining the walls, noting the way the symbols seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles. "Where is Samuel Blackridge?" "Gone," said a voice from the shadows. "Transformed? Ascended to a higher purpose." The men spun around to find Samuel standing in the doorway, but he was no longer the man they remembered. His limbs were elongated, his skin pale as moonlight, and his eyes contained depths that seemed to go on forever. "Dear God," Dr. Voss breathed. "What have you become?" Samuel smiled, revealing teeth that were sharp and numerous. "I have become what every Blackridge man was destined to become. I have fulfilled the covenant that was made when this house was built." Sheriff Morrison drew his gun, but found that his hand was trembling so badly he could barely hold it. "You're under arrest for whatever you've done to those children." "I've given them a gift," Samuel replied, his voice carrying harmonics that made the stone walls vibrate. "The same gift I'm about to give to you." The attack came without warning. Samuel moved with inhuman speed, his transformed body flowing like liquid darkness. Sheriff Morrison managed to fire once, but the bullet seemed to pass through Samuel without effect. Dr. Voss died first, his mind shattered by direct contact with the entity that Samuel had become. Pastor Williams lasted longer, his faith providing some protection, but eventually he too succumbed to the darkness that poured from Samuel like a flood. Sheriff Morrison fought the longest, his will strengthened by years of facing down human evil. But in the end, he too was overwhelmed. His consciousness dissolved into the vast alien intelligence that had consumed the Blackridge family. When it was over, Samuel stood alone in the chamber, surrounded by the bodies of men who had been transformed into something beyond human understanding. They would rise again in time, but they would no longer be the men they had been. The investigation was officially closed when the search party failed to return. A larger expedition was organized, but when they reached the house, they found it abandoned and partially collapsed, as if it had been struck by some tremendous force. Samuel was never seen again, but his influence remained. The children he had touched grew up to become adults who carried the darkness within them, spreading it to their own families, their own communities. And in the ruins of the house on the hill, the rocking chair continued to move, counting down the years until the next phase of the plan would begin. The Blackridge legacy had entered a new stage, one that would eventually encompass far more than a single family or a single town. The door had been opened, and what lay beyond was patient, vast, and utterly alien, but the story was far from over. The entity that had claimed the Blackridge bloodline had plans that stretched far beyond the hills of Massachusetts, plans that would one day encompass all of humanity. And in 1971, those plans would take their next significant step forward. Dr. Elena Vasquez had been excavating historical sites for 15 years, but she had never encountered anything quite like the ruins on Millgate Hill. It was September 1971, and she stood at the edge of what local records claimed had once been the Blackridge family homestead. The foundation stones were still visible, arranged in a pattern that seemed somehow wrong, not architecturally, but geometrically, as if the angles didn't quite conform to normal three-dimensional space. Professor Vasquez, her graduate assistant Michael Chen, approached with a manila folder in his hands. "I've been going through the historical records from the Millgate Historical Society. There's something you need to see." Elena accepted the folder, noting how Michael's hands trembled slightly as he passed it to her. The young man had been increasingly nervous since they'd begun the excavation 3 weeks ago, claiming he was having trouble sleeping and experiencing vivid nightmares about the site. "What did you find?" she asked, opening the folder to reveal photocopies of old newspaper clippings and handwritten documents. "It's not what I found," Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's what I didn't find. Professor, there's almost no documentation of the Blackridge family after 1892. It's as if they just vanished." Elena studied the documents. The earliest record showed the purchase of the land by Elias Blackridge in 1814, followed by sporadic mentions of the family in local birth and death records. But Michael was right. After 1892, there was virtually nothing. "What about the 1900 census?" she asked. "No record of any Blackridges in Millgate, or anywhere else in Massachusetts for that matter." Michael pointed to a newspaper clipping dated October 15th, 1892. "This is the last official mention of the family. A report about a missing persons investigation." Elena read the yellowed text carefully. Sheriff Morrison and 5 other men had gone missing while investigating disturbances at the Blackridge property. A second search party had found the house abandoned and partially collapsed, with no trace of the missing men. "Interesting," she murmured. "What about local folklore? Surely there are stories about what happened here." Michael's face went pale. "That's just it, Professor. The locals won't talk about it. I've tried interviewing some of the older residents, people whose families have lived here for generations. They all say the same thing, that the hill is cursed, that nothing good ever came from the Blackridge house, and that we should leave well enough alone." Elena looked out over the excavation site, where her team of graduate students was carefully sifting through the ruins. They had made some interesting discoveries: fragments of books with text in Latin and other languages she didn't recognize, pieces of furniture that seemed to be carved from a type of wood that didn't match any known species, and most intriguingly, a set of stone steps that led down to what appeared to be a basement chamber. "Have you been having the dreams too?" Michael asked suddenly. Elena turned to look at him. "What dreams?" "The ones about the chair, the rocking chair in the basement. I keep dreaming about it night after night. It's always moving back and forth, and there's something sitting in it, but I can never quite see what it is." A chill ran down Elena's spine. She had been having similar dreams, but she had attributed them to the stress of the excavation. Now, hearing Michael describe identical visions, she began to wonder if something else was at work. "Michael, have you discussed these dreams with any of the other students?" He nodded reluctantly. "Sarah's been having them too, and Jim, And Professor, there's something else. Yesterday, when we were clearing the basement stairs, I found something. Michael reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. I know I should have logged it properly, but I wanted to read it first. Professor, this journal belonged to Elias Blackridge, the original owner of the house. Elena took the journal with trembling hands. The leather cover was worn smooth, and when she opened it, she could smell the musty scent of old parchment and something else. Something that reminded her of copper and earth and things that had been buried for too long. The entries were written in a neat, precise hand, but as she flipped through the pages, she noticed that the handwriting gradually became more erratic, the letters growing larger and more angular with each entry. October 12th, 1814. The voices grow stronger each day. Martha thinks I'm going mad, but I know better. They are calling me to this place for a purpose that will ensure our family's legacy for generations to come. November 3rd, 1814. I have begun construction of the house. The workers are nervous, claiming they hear whispers in the walls. They do not understand that the whispers are a blessing, not a curse. December 15th, 1814. The basement chamber is complete. I have found the chair, just as they promised I would. It is beautiful, carved from wood that is not of this earth. When I sit in it, I can hear the voices more clearly. They tell me of things that were, things that are, and things that will be. Elena continued reading, her horror growing with each entry. The journal documented Elias Blackridge's gradual descent into madness, his transformation into something that was no longer entirely human, and his preparations for a ritual that would ensure his family's service to entities that existed beyond human comprehension. The final entry was dated January 20th, 1815. The ritual is complete. My son will be born tonight, and he will carry the gift that I have received. The covenant is established. The door is open. What comes next will reshape the world in ways that mortals cannot imagine. I am no longer Elias Blackridge. I am something greater, something that serves a purpose beyond human understanding. The chair waits for my son, and his son after him, and his son after that. The Blackridge legacy will endure until the stars themselves burn out and the universe returns to the darkness from which it came. Elena closed the journal, her hands shaking. Michael, we need to contact the authorities. This site needs to be sealed off, studied by experts in whatever this is. Professor, Michael said quietly, there's something else. Something I found in the basement chamber yesterday evening, after the rest of the team had left. Elena felt her blood run cold. What did you find? The rocking chair. It's still there, Professor. After all these years, it's still there. And it's still moving. Before Elena could respond, she heard shouting from the excavation site. She and Michael ran toward the sound, finding the rest of the team gathered around the entrance to the basement chamber. What's happening? Elena called out. Sarah Martinez, one of her most reliable graduate students, turned to face her with wide, frightened eyes. Professor, you need to see this. The stones, they're bleeding. Elena pushed through the group and saw what Sarah was talking about. The stone walls of the chamber were indeed bleeding. Not red blood, but something darker, thicker, more ancient. It was seeping from the cracks between the stones and running down the walls in patterns that seemed to form symbols. Everyone out, Elena ordered. Now, we're evacuating the site immediately. But as the team began to retreat, Elena felt something pulling her toward the chamber, not a physical force, but something deeper, something that spoke to a part of her mind she hadn't known existed. Professor, Michael called out, don't go down there. But Elena was already descending the stone steps, drawn by a compulsion she couldn't resist. The bleeding walls seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat, and with each step downward, she could hear whispers in a language that predated human speech. At the bottom of the stairs, she found herself in a circular chamber carved from the living rock. The walls were covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly, and in the center of the room sat a wooden rocking chair, its high back carved with intricate designs that hurt to look at. The chair was moving, back and forth with a slow, hypnotic rhythm. And although it appeared to be empty, Elena could sense a presence in it, something vast and patient and utterly alien. Dr. Vasquez, a voice said behind her, you have come at last. Elena spun around to find a tall, impossibly thin figure standing in the doorway. Its features were indistinct, seeming to shift between human and something else entirely, and its eyes contained depths that seemed to go on forever. "Who are you?" she whispered. "I am what remains of Samuel Blackridge," the entity replied. "The last of the bloodline to serve the Covenant. I have been waiting for you, Dr. Vasquez. Waiting for someone with the knowledge and the will to complete what my family began." Elena tried to back away, but found that her legs wouldn't obey her. "What do you want?" "I want you to understand," Samuel said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the stone walls vibrate. "I want you to see the truth about what happened here, about what was accomplished, about what still needs to be done." The entity gestured toward the rocking chair, and Elena felt herself drawn forward despite her terror. As she approached, she began to see things, not with her eyes, but with some deeper perception that had been awakened by her presence in the chamber. She saw the past, Elias Blackridge following voices to this hill, building the house over an ancient site that had been sacred to things that existed before humanity learned to make fire. She saw Thomas Blackridge's transformation from scholar to servant of cosmic forces beyond human comprehension. She saw Samuel's final ritual, the opening of the door between worlds, and the spread of alien influence throughout the town of Millgate. She saw the present, the chair still serving as a focal point for energies that existed beyond the normal dimensions of space and time. The entity that had been Samuel Blackridge, sustained by forces that transcended human understanding, waiting patiently for the next phase of the plan to begin. And she saw the future, a world where the barriers between dimensions had fallen completely, where humanity served purposes that they could never fully understand, where the cosmos itself had been transformed into something that aligned with the will of entities that existed in the darkness between stars. "It is beautiful," Elena whispered, tears streaming down her face. "It is perfect." "Yes," Samuel agreed. "And now it is time for you to help bring it to pass." Elena approached the rocking chair, understanding flooding through her like a dark tide. She knew what she had to do, what she had always been destined to do. The archaeological expedition had been no accident. She had been drawn here by the same forces that had once called to Elias Blackridge. She sat in the chair and immediately felt the connection form, not just to the entity that had been Samuel, but to the vast network of influence that had been growing for over a century. She could sense the other carriers, the descendants of those who had been touched by the Blackridge legacy, scattered across the country and beyond. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you document," Samuel replied. "You publish your findings, you ensure that the world knows about what was discovered here, and you prepare for the next phase of the plan." Elena nodded, understanding perfectly. Her archaeological credentials, her reputation in the academic community, her connections to universities and museums around the world, all of it would serve the purpose for which she had been chosen. Over the following months, Elena published a series of papers about the Blackridge site, carefully edited to present the findings in terms that wouldn't immediately trigger alarm. She described the ruins as evidence of an unusual 19th century religious community, and the basement chamber as a remarkable example of vernacular sacred architecture. But to those who knew how to read between the lines, to those who carried the dormant influence in their bloodlines, the papers were something else entirely. They were a call to action, a signal that the time had come for the next phase of the plan to begin. The Blackridge legacy had entered its final stage. The door that had been opened in 1892 was now ready to swing wide, and what lay beyond was patient, vast, and utterly alien. But most importantly, it was no longer alone. The entity that had once been Samuel Blackridge smiled as it watched Elena work, her transformed consciousness now serving the same purpose that had consumed 3 generations of his family. The covenant was complete, the bloodline extended, and the work could continue. In the darkness between stars, ancient powers stirred, sensing that their long wait was nearly over. Soon, very soon, the world would understand its true purpose, and humanity would finally serve the masters it had always been meant to serve. The rocking chair continued to move, counting down the days until the final revelation would begin.